Yes, and I can see that we have a quorum of the Actuarial Committee of the Pension Review Board.
The meeting will come to order.
The meeting now comes to order, and call on Ashley Rendon to take attendance of the committee.
Robert Bain.
Here.
Keith Rader.
Here.
Josh McGee.
Present.
Move to the approval of the December 15, 2016 meeting minutes.
Yeah, that's his.
Approval of the.
Yeah, we now need to move to approval of the December 15, 2016 committee minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move we suspend reading of the minutes. Second.
A motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
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 The minutes are approved as circulated.
That the minutes now are approved as circulated.
So moved. Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 We'll move to the next agenda item, receive update from the City of Fort Worth.
We now are moving to receive an update from the City of Fort Worth and the Fort Worth Employees Retirement System. I would like for the representatives from both the City of Fort Worth and representatives of the Employees Retirement System of Fort Worth to come forward. And I see we have 3 people who have come forward. We appreciate your being down here to discuss the issues of the Fort Worth Retirement System with our committee with the Actuarial Committee of the Pension Review Board. So we're ready at this time to
Hear from the city first.
to hear from the city first.
Okay.
Thanks again for being here.
Could you please all introduce yourselves?
Be glad to. I'm David Cook, City Manager with the City of Fort Worth.
Susan Alanis, Assistant City Manager.
I'm Joelle Mevy, the Executive Director of the Retirement Fund.
Thank you, and I'll kick it off and ask Susan to do any cleanup if that's okay. We've prepared for you a 4-page summary of what Fort Worth has been doing for really the last 10 years and what will proceed for the near future. And so I'll touch on some of those highlights and be glad to turn it over to Susan and then answer any questions you might have. We're happy to be here to talk about that journey we've been on. I mentioned it's been about a 10-year journey so far. On the journey so far, we've, on a city standpoint, have increased contributions from the employer, or I should say the taxpayer, nearly doubling the contributions over that period of time. We've also reduced the benefit for both police, fire, and general employees. We've more accurately calculated and valued the cost of living adjustments that occur in the program. And also, we have successfully defended the benefit reductions in both state and federal court. So a lot of that playing out over that period of time was litigation and then successfully going through the court system. We're here in 2017, though, knowing that that's not enough on a go-forward basis. We had the economic recession in 2008-9, that period of time, and you couple that with the reduction in investment returns and also appropriately reducing the discount rate or the rate of return. And so we still have an increased unfunded liability that we need to address in the city of Fort Worth. 2 years ago, the mayor and the council asked me to put together a pension task force to look at how we could make the pension more sustainable over the long period of time. We've included employee groups on that, citizens, our financial advisor, Joelle's a member of that committee. And we've been working for the last roughly 18 months or so on strategies on a go-forward basis. So what I thought I'd share with you the actions that have been taken thus far and where we really still need to go. Our council has already provided a 90-day notice that we're going to reduce the interest rate that the fund pays in. These are people before they get vested. There's a guaranteed rate of return that's not tied to any short-term investment instruments, and we think there's a better connection to short-term interest rates instead of guaranteeing a 5.25% return for that period of time. We've identified what I've described as some low-hanging fruit, working with the retirement fund, suspending a drop annuity option, eliminating non-qualified service purchase and additional credit service, which is not when it's not actuarially neutral, and elimination of service credit for accrued medical or sick leave. And what that is getting a benefit without any contributions going in from either the employee or the employer. We're looking at data from TMRS to evaluate the cost of moving all or some of our employees to TMRS. We've reserved $4 million in this year's budget, general fund budget, as an increase in the employer contribution. It's currently really just a set-aside strategy because we do think there needs to still be changes to the benefit as well as increase employee contributions. We've looked at we've initiated legal analysis and legislative changes that might be necessary to phase general employees out of the legacy fund and or separate the funds, separating police and fire from the general employee group. And finally, we've commenced the next round of collective bargaining with our local 440, that's our Firefighters Association. We have a joint meeting with the Employee Retirement Fund in November. I left out, we've hired consultants that were working with the pension task force that's running all kind of different scenarios for us as we move forward. We expect that we'll have an update on our, what do we call it, financial soundness restoration plan right after the first of the year as we evaluate how we're going to move some of these strategies forward. Let me ask Susan to add anything that I might have left out, and then I'll be glad to answer any questions.
I think you did a good job.
Members, do you have any questions?
Can you please clarify the Social Security status of your employees?
We are not in Social Security
All or
for no employees, any group.
About, was it how long ago? Almost 2 years ago that there was a meeting in Arlington that you had, if I recall, you attended at that time and discussed the Fort Worth situation. We also were hearing from the Dallas folks at that same time. And I had a sense that you thought that that you were moving in the right direction, that you thought things would be better. And so I am some concerned that maybe 2 years later almost that it's as if nothing has changed in the last 2 years, yet you have discussed a number of things that have changed. But is it like you're sort of holding your own more, as opposed to so far having been able to make any real movement to a stronger position. Can you can you talk about that 2-year period and what I'm either hearing correctly or incorrectly that was said that day in Arlington?
Yeah. So I'd say that's probably an accurate reflection of that conversation in Arlington. And let me offer a few other things, because what I think occurred, and I can't remember if it occurred right before Arlington or after, Moody's has downgraded the city of Fort Worth twice in the last 3 years, right? And that is almost uniquely related to the increasing unfunded liability of the pension, right? And so the strategies that the mayor and the council took between 2007 and 2015, which were really changing the benefit, and that was first general employees got changed, that the multiplier got reduced from 3 to 2.5, then police, and I think it was 2012, and fire in 2015. Seeing the results of that, but what also was occurring is the rate of return wasn't being achieved in the fund, right? So we were still using also, I believe, an 8% discount rate. So as we appropriately update the discount rate or the rate of return, right, and the returns from prior year get blended in, it really was like holding your own, right? Because those things increase the unfunded liability over the long term. That's why we knew that there had to be strategies outside just the rate of return assumption changes, which takes us to seriously talking about contribution changes, both from the taxpayers or the employer and from the employees. And I think we're now having a more realistic conversation of what that might look like. Also a more realistic conversation of maybe more benefit changes also have to occur. So I think that 2-year time frame, has put us more in the position of everybody sitting around the table better understanding and knowing that changes have to occur.
The reform discussion are you using the 7.75, your current discount rates, as kind of the bogey in the reform discussion?
We're actually looking at lower rates too. So we're not just leaving it at 7 3/4. We've run scenarios at 7, and we've run scenarios at lower rates, more of what the rating agencies are using, right? So that's a little bit under 7, and some would even say that should even be lower.
And I'll add one thing that in our system, the retirement board actually sets those assumptions. The city does not. And so part of our strategy in working with our city council, because they control benefit structure, is to do a risk assessment by having calculations of all of the different proposals at those lower rates as well for them to consider. But it's the board that controls what that assumption is.
I appreciate that, but if you lower the rate and send them more money, they're not exactly going to turn that down.
Correct.
So you have to control how much money you send them, and the rate of return is a big factor in how much money you send them.
Sure.
So would appreciate if the city took some ownership of the funding policy itself.
I'll add one other thing. One thing that's a little bit unique about our system compared to other cities, though, is that our structure is percentage of payroll and versus ARC, and so we lose some of that fluctuation that happens as those assumptions evolve, and so it creates different pros and cons for each side in terms of what their actions are, for sure.
One big question I have around the plan and the actions that have been taken so far, you guys should be commended for taking those actions and for being very proactive and for all the steps you've taken. What's a little fuzzier for me is what success looks like. What are you trying to achieve here? If you get to the end of this and you've got good reform, what does that look like? So what are the kind of key items that you're trying to achieve with this reform?
That's a great question, and our conversation around the table starts with we need to be able to recruit and retain the best employee, whether they're in the fire service, the police service, or general employees that are providing the myriad of services to local government. And so the pension or the retirement system is part of that conversation. At the same time, we also say we got to balance that with what the taxpayer and the ratepayers, will accept on the payment side. So it's be able to recruit and retain, right, the best people in all those different professions at a cost that doesn't jeopardize really what we're trying to do in the cost of service in the city. One of our conversations also about general employees is the ability, again, to recruit and retain, and that looks more and more like something that is portable outside of the city of Fort Worth. That is why we're exploring the TMRS as one of those options, so that we can recruit people in that has a portable benefit coming in, and then if people leave Fort Worth, they have a portable benefit going out. With this purely defined benefit, that's solely the city of Fort Worth. That's not a great recruitment and retention for the general employee. That model might fit better for police and fires. The turnover is much, much smaller. So those are, to give you a little flavor, to me it goes back to recruiting and retaining people and doing it at a cost that's acceptable to taxpayers.
I appreciate that. I think recruit and retain is a big part of it. I would encourage you on the sustainable funding of the pension plan side of things to have some specific items that you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to get to a place where you've got a 30-year closed interval amortization schedule, let's say so out loud and set that up clearly as a measure of success.
Sure.
If you're trying to hit a cost number for the city, let's make sure we set that up and kind of understand. Right now I don't have an understanding of where you're trying to go. Recruit and retain is great, but it's kind of a vague concept, and I agree with you that portability is important for a lot of different types of employees. But I also have a desire to get more specific as to what we're trying to achieve on the funding side for the legacy system as well, given that is the reason we're talking about this. One additional point is recruit and retain. To the extent that you're going to talk about recruit and retain, salary and job conditions matter a lot for recruit and retain, more than deferred compensation. And so you need to make sure that you consider that in those conversations as well.
Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Please, can one of you describe your drop plan? In particular, can you describe who is eligible, how long the plan is in place, and the percentage
So
interest paid on the account?
there's zero interest paid on the accounts. So anyone who is eligible for normal retirement is able to enter into the drop program for up to 5 years. During their participation in drop, both the city and the member continue to make the contributions that they would ordinarily have made. So in terms of comparative drop programs, it's pretty conservative from that standpoint.
All employees can participate?
That's correct, all employee groups.
5 years?
Yes, sir.
Nothing paid on the drop accounts?
That's right.
They contribute while they're in drop status?
That's correct.
And additionally, they will, if they're in that drop program for 2 years, a minimum of 2 years, they're eligible for COLA. If they leave the drop program before 2 years, they don't receive a COLA for that period of time.
A COLA once they retire?
Yes. The COLA will be retroactive if they stay in for 3 to 5 years, will be retroactive to the time of the entry into the drop program.
You're saying that if they leave before 2 years, then they'll never get a COLA?
Well, they won't get a COLA for the 2 years.
Oh, I see. Okay. Thank you. I thought I recalled reading somewhere in the literature that workers do not contribute on overtime pay. Pension plan, is that right?
So previously, overtime was part of the calculation of high 3 of the benefit, and that was part of the challenge that we had in terms of spiking. And so with the reforms that we implemented, we eliminated overtime from that calculation to solve that.
So it's not in there anymore.
Right, but what I will add is that the city has contributed to continued to make contributions on overtime for the reason that the way we bifurcated the benefit, there is still sort of this lag time of overtime consequences for the old service credit of the members when they retire. So there's still an impact on that, and our concern was that if we discontinued contributions on future overtime, that would negatively affect the outcome of that. So.
You mentioned reducing the multiplier. Did that apply to future service of current workers?
Yes, and that's the piece that we litigated.
And you the city prevailed
We did.
in that change. I didn't see this in the literature. Do any of you know whether you're using a level percentage or level dollar actuarial method? Could you just let us know, please?
No.
For amortization.
For amortization, I would have to, I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
And as
I
a
understand.
continuance of that, it would be nice to know if you're using level percent, level dollar, open or closed.
Yep.
It's our understanding that this system uses a level percent open.
It is open, and that is one of the conversations we've been having with our our consultant as well, as we work our way through the future reforms, is evaluating the implications of that open methodology.
Well, I can tell you what the implications of that open methodology are. It's that you'll never pay down your pension debt because you've got negative amortization throughout the entire period, meaning that you're not making headway on the principal.
Right.
And so that is a big concern, especially for a severely underfunded plan. That's not even a tread water scenario. That's a strategy that will lead to declining funded ratios just because of the way that you're handling interest. Just like credit card, and you pay the minimum.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you all had set aside something on did you say $4 million? What portion of the employer's annual contribution does that represent for a single year?
That roughly represents 1% of payroll. So our payroll is roughly $400 million.
So if you're short from the required contribution right now by about 8%, that $4 million is just about 1/8 of that.
That's accurate.
One other question, Mr. Chairman, if I might, and that is the PFM contract. Can you clarify the status of that?
So we engaged in that in early summer, and we are actively meeting with them. And in fact, they will be here on Tuesday to participate in the task force. We've got detailed analyses of different scenarios that they're running for us now, and that will be the basis of the recommendations that we make to the City Council in the course of that joint meeting in November. And then the basis for our funding soundness restoration plan and any votes of employee contribution increases and so on that will be in the coming months.
So you're already under a contract with PFM?
Oh, yes. We're well into that agreement.
Okay. And one final question. Who is your primary consulting actuary?
The actuary for the retirement fund
The actuarial.
valuation is GRS.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I? Or you have questions?
Yeah, I have a question or two. What's the overall size of your city and the number of people over this? Has that been moving up or has that been dropping? Have you had any big layoff of a major employer in the city in the last couple of 3 years? I don't have a good handle on Fort Worth. I know Texas as a whole is doing well, but that doesn't necessarily mean it translates across individually city by city.
So we're blessed in Fort Worth. We're actually growing at roughly 20 to 25,000 people a year in Fort Worth, and a lot of that is led just by job growth in the Metroplex. And so the growth is impacting all infrastructure and services. So we added, I want to say, 100 and some employees in this last year's budget, even while decreasing the tax rate 3 cents, because we do have to get our tax rate more competitive, both in the Metroplex and in Texas. But we are growing, some would say, leaps and bounds year over year. And so there is a growing workforce, but also the number of retirees, so the total members going into the program are increasing as well.
So that's sort of a mix. I mean, it's definitely a positive, but it means that even with that help, you've still got some of these difficult situations
Absolutely.
that we've talked about on your pension plan. Let's see.
May I add one thing to that? So the normal cost of the new benefit structure is about 12%. And so the good news is as our workforce grows and as we have turnover, those new members of the plan are actually really increasing the amount of dollars that can be directed towards that unfunded liability. So we are positioned fairly well with the structure that we've adopted for the future service of existing and the new employees.
Has GRS recommended moving to a closed amortization method?
We haven't asked, the Board of Trustees has not asked them to opine on that question, so we don't have it. I don't know if PFM is.
Our consultant actually has recommended that, and part of our strategy is to work through what the menu of solution options are with our current assumptions, and then figuring out what would need to be layered on top of that to solve some of the methodology problems we have with the actuarial report. So we're working through all of that simultaneously before we come up with our future plan.
Thank you.
And on that point, I would recommend very strongly having a conversation with your consultant about what an adequate funding policy would look like, and then devising solutions that solve for this, whatever you're going for.
Exactly.
I have concerns that you will be solving for a solution under a 7.75% rate of return. Open amortization, if you solve for a solution that gets you down to 30-year open 7.75, I would guarantee you nearly that you would be in the same scenario that you're in, that you've been in over the last decade, which is one of this being something that you have to deal with on an ongoing basis, where there are serial reforms, where workers are subject to continuing cuts, to continuing increases, and everybody is better off if we have kind of a clear vision for what success looks like, and we solve this once and for all.
PFM very clearly understands that that's our expectation of the outcome of their work.
Got it.
I would note that, and maybe you all already know this, that one of the large state systems, the State Employees of Texas system, two things about them. One is GRS is it may be different actuaries in GRS, are the actuaries over at the state system. And after a whole lot of discussion over a couple of years, and I'm sure they would be interacting with each other if they haven't been, they have tightened up some. Instead of an 8% investment return, they're at 7.5%, and they looked hard at being at 7.25%. At a meeting they had a couple of 3 months ago. There's a movement in that direction around the country, and a serious look at further reduction than to be at 7.75 would be in order, in my opinion. So you're in a way in a helpful place, because you've got the same actuarial group that's there that could see and tell you what's happened. Wasn't easy, as yours has not been easy, but that is there. And isn't it true that nationally, one of the average actuarial rates, it's right at 7.5%. It's dropped down from higher than that.
The median for public plans is right around 7.5. I will say that the bigger and more sophisticated plans are going lower faster. So CalPERS is down to 7, and a lot of the big plans, New York is down to 7. A lot of the big sophisticated plans that understand risk better than some of the others are getting there faster than that median, and those proactive steps are very helpful to them. I'm a little, I know this is not kind of completely indicative of where you guys are going, but the RVK analysis that showed the different rates of return, I'm a little worried. So the rates of return that they showed seem pretty optimistic to me, and seem pretty optimistic relative to other investment advisor rates that I've seen. So I'm a little concerned. There's a danger here in this world that we end up with some pretty circular reasoning in terms of the consultants that work for pension plans. Your investment advisor will come in and ask, okay, what's your discount rate? And they'll structure their analysis to hit that discount rate, and they'll center their analysis there without asking the broader question of what do we really think the rate of return is going to be going forward. So I would encourage you to be very skeptical and ask a lot of questions around that in particular. I also, if you look at those numbers, their median scenario has they label it here as risk, but it's standard deviation of 15 almost. That has big implications for your plan. That just means that returns, I think, under your current allocation are pretty risky. And so you need to consider risk going forward and be prepared for any future unfunded liabilities that might result from that. I think also from the standpoint of the effort that you guys are engaging in and trying to improve funding policy and devise a solution, you also need a go-forward funding plan that actually builds in the flexibility to change with economic conditions. Right now, you're a fixed rate plan, and that does not at all flex with changing demographic or economic conditions. It requires you to then come back to the table and negotiate again. I would encourage you to move in the direction of something that is more flexible, that has less potential. I saw some graphs on here, difference between actuarially determined contribution and actual contribution, been shortened a lot of years. And that's the result of having assumptions that are above what is actually realized, and then inflexibility to actually meet the cost of the plan.
If I may address that. So the asset liability study that RVK conducted for the retirement fund was done in 2015. The capital market assumptions, I believe, is what you're referencing, were probably more optimistic than you see capital market assumptions 2 years later. The current standard deviation on the portfolio is sitting right around 13%, so certainly the asset liability study was much more conservative in its approach, and it was intentional to certainly give us a stark presentation of what the worst case scenario could be. With regard to the assumption for investment returns, 7.75% is still in the range of reasonableness according to both our prior actuary and our current actuary. Siegel was our actuary who conducted the most recent experience study, and that was also done in early 2016. And at the time, they did not recommend a change in actuarial assumption for the return. And now GRS is our new actuary, and it's a little premature for them to make a recommendation. They were asked by the board if the return assumption was reasonable, and they concurred that it was. However, once we do an experience study with them, which would likely happen in another year, we would defer to their expertise on what is happening. Currently, the fund year-to-date return is 11.6% for the calendar year-to-date.
That's great. That's fantastic. I would just add that given what's occurred over the last 20 years, it is my opinion that we should stop being so deferential to our advisors, especially there's an odd power dynamic given that you pay them and that you have a rate of return and they understand the implications of lowering that. I have not seen very many instances of actuaries coming in and saying that current rate of return was unreasonable and making that determination. In fact, maybe some of my committee members could come up with an example. Usually they use softer ways of saying that you should lower it. So it's not very convincing to me to hear that your actuary has said that it's reasonable. And I'm asking you to take a little bit of ownership of that for your fiduciary responsibility to make sure there's enough money going into this plan. And I think that by and large, I want to see more of our city executives, our plan executives, take ownership of these decisions and be skeptical of the advice that you're getting from your advisors. Take it in, but you are the decision makers. And clearly on funding, on investments, this plan has fallen short. And so increasing the amount of ownership that you take in that and not being so deferential, I think, is an appropriate action.
I agree with what you're saying. I would say again, I having sat through a full day's worth of discussion with the actuary at State Employees Retirement, that day with that system, they were pushing for harder than they got. They were pushing for a 7.25, and there's a counter push from employees for higher, and they ended up at 7.5 as the interest rate is what the board said. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for pointing out that this RRV case study was from 2 years ago. That's relevant. What inflation assumption are you all using?
We're using 2.5.
So you've got a real rate of return of over 5.25. And can you clarify the time frame of when the rate will be, your investment return assumption will be revisited?
It's typically, has historically been revisited with the experience study, and we conduct one of those every 3 years. So we're still a year off from conducting an experience study. Would be early 2019, likely. Having said that, certainly the initiative for a discussion could come up from the board. As of yet, that has not happened. Certainly, the question gets asked every year at the valuation, so that there is discussion around it, but there hasn't been, as you say, realistically, it hasn't been driven from our experts. Having said that, I would not profess to be an actuary, so I don't know that I would be the expert to say whether a range of reasonableness is below what our actuary has said. I kind of feel that best practices says to follow the advice of your expert. So certainly there's room for discussion on it, but it has not been driven by our board as yet.
So I'll mention that the city's chief financial officer is one of the appointed members of the board. The city does not hold a majority in terms of our appointments. It's mostly member representation. The CFO every year during the valuation report has a discussion about that very issue, that the city's position is that assumed rate of return is still too high.
Well, ultimately, as long as the required contribution is not being made, the investment return assumption is somewhat academic. And that's where we are right now, because we are well short of making the required contribution. And so whatever return assumption we've got in place, it doesn't really matter if we're not going to make the required contribution. And I am sure that the city has come to realize that everything else is sort of academic until either we come up with the money that's required to fund the plan and reduce the unfunded liability, and or we reduce benefits enough to do the same.
Yes, sir.
Is there general consensus that that's where we are, is that the city needs more to commit more money or reduce benefits?
So when we say we agree with that, and we means not just the taxpayer, we also means the employees. So yes, contributions either need to increase or the benefit needs to change. I think we're real clear on that.
So there's consensus in Fort Worth that one of those two things, or both,
a combination of both,
have to happen.
Yep.
And that all the talk about the return assumption and other methods and assumptions and so on is interesting and ultimately relevant, but right now the most important factor is getting more money into the plan or reducing the promises.
Yep.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier you had discussion with TMRS, the statewide system for cities. I just wanted to go back over that, how the degree at which you've discussed, is it something you've done in the past but are not actively considering now, or is it still an open issue that you're looking at?
So we asked them to prepare an analysis about new employees in each of the groups joining TMRS and what the math of that would be, essentially. And one of the things that we found is that the city's contribution appears to be higher into that system than what's necessary for our portion of the normal cost with the new benefit with us. So now our consultant is helping us understand what the implications are to the legacy plan and what resources would be needed for both systems. So I don't know that it's entirely promising to think that that's an option for us. It would need to be necessary and appropriate for some of our other objectives, like David mentioned, regarding portability long-term and some of the long-term sustainability questions. But as you all know, that would create some immediate financial implications for the legacy plan that would be difficult. So, again, they provided the initial reports, I think, a week or two ago, and so our consultant is reviewing those, and that will be part of the discussion in the coming months with the committee.
I know that over a long period of years there was litigation going on in Fort Worth between, I believe, the fire police and the city. And I believe I just wanted to confirm that you said earlier you're not in those litigations are history now. You don't have anything happening now on the legal front.
No, in both the state and the federal system, all of the appellate options have been exhausted in those, so that those are concluded. However, we are concerned as we watch litigation in other systems what implications that could have for the victory we feel like we've won, and we'll just continue to monitor those in other cities.
I'd like to go back and just make a note on something you said about so moving new employees to TMRS or some other system. You said that there are financial implications for the legacy system. I would be highly skeptical of any claims around that. You're talking about just putting the normal cost in a new system. You guys, the city, taxpayers, are responsible for paying down the debt. Where new members go has no implications for your debt service payments.
I don't think I said that correctly. Let me say it differently. The financial implications for the city of dealing with the implications to the legacy plan to not have the growing number of new members joining and that kind of thing, and the shrinking base. I mean, so
but I'm saying
out,
that your payroll base, your total payroll base, is not changing. It's not like the city is going out of business. You can make debt service payments on the entire payroll base. I'm telling you that there are no real financial implications. This is just a accounting exercise that hangs people up sometimes, and that you should view the unfunded liability as a debt, and the debt service cost should be the same, regardless of where new employees are going. Those normal cost payments go to pay for the benefits that new employees are earning on the plan. If I look at, you could be at a point where if you were about to exhaust assets, that you need those normal cost payments to keep from going completely pay-go. But if I look at your outflows relative to your asset base, it's only 2-3%. So I find it hard to believe that there are serious implications of normal cost payments going anywhere else, regardless of what's going on with the legacy plan.
Well, this isn't the place or time to debate it, but I would not say that there are no implications. There are some implications. And another place and time we could discuss what those implications are.
That would be great. I would be happy to discuss with you after this. I think that actuaries often get hung up on this point and get hung up on payroll base, but your payroll base is going to be what it is. And like I said, the debt is what it is, and you need to take responsibility for paying that down. So this is largely an accounting exercise, but we can have a discussion about that after the fact.
Do you have any further questions of us? We've been asking ours of you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to thank the folks from Fort Worth for coming down and sharing the information that you shared, and I appreciate the efforts that you're making up there. I know it's a very difficult situation that you're facing, and I'm not sure how we could help, but if we can possibly help, please let us know.
This might be a question for Anu, but or for you or your representatives in the state legislature. Are you in any reactive mode with them? I'm not saying you should be. I'm just saying I'm interested in whether that's certainly there was a heavy interaction between Dallas Fire and Police and the state legislature this last session, as an example.
And we were doing our best to stay out of that.
That would understand. Yeah, I wasn't suggesting.
Actually, no, I did say that a little flippantly, but we were doing our best to stay out of the Dallas-Houston thing. We do keep in close contact with Representative Flynn, and actually the mayor and I will be meeting with him in November as well, giving him an update of where we are.
And the fund intends to meet with Representative Flynn as well in November.
You have something?
I would also like to thank you guys for coming and presenting here. Really appreciate the open and transparent spirit and being willing to come here. And if there's anything we can do to help out, please let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Next item, yes.
Kenny?
Kenny.
The next item on our report is item 5 on my outline, an update of the actuarial valuation reports and discussion of certain retirement systems, and looking to staff member Kenny Herbold to discuss that with us.
Good afternoon, members. My name is Kenny Herbold. I'm the PRB staff actuary. I'd like to direct your attention to tab 3. We have an updated AV report. There's only a handful of changes since the board meeting, but there were a couple of items discussed at the board meeting that we thought would be worth mentioning. Generally speaking, though, there isn't much change. If you look at the summary of statistics, there isn't much change. Excuse me. There isn't much change from the board meeting or from the prior effective date to current effective date. It's very similar to what was presented at the August board meeting. But I did want to direct your attention to a couple of items on the detailed pages. We did mention that Dallas ERF was at an infinite amortization period but we were in the process of reviewing a projection prepared by their actuary. They have that has since been updated to 47 years, so they did come down quite a bit, as well as Odessa Fire was listed as infinite, and we got a new funding valve from them with an additional projection. I will note, though, that the footnote on Dallas ERF isn't entirely accurate. We did not calculate the 47-year amortization period. That was done by the plan's actuary. In addition, there was some concern at the board meeting, or there was some concern expressed about Longview Fire at the board meeting. I believe part of that was they have had a fairly low funded ratio for probably the past decade. If you look back at their history, they were in okay shape in 2007 before the 2008 crash, and they actually went from 74% funded ratio in 2007 down to 54% in 2009. And then have subsequently dropped down to about 45% at the end of 2016. So they have been putting forth some effort over the past 4 or 5 years to kind of address some of that. So in 2013 and 2015, they did make changes to their active employee benefits. And then effective in 2016, they have made additional changes for new hires. They've also been increasing contributions, both employer and employee. And as a matter of fact, the existing funding valuation does not reflect an increase in employer contribution effective 10/1/2017, and so that has a decent effect in bringing their amortization period from over 50 down, I think, to the mid-40s, I believe is what I was told. And there is an additional step that they have not taken yet with the employer contributions, so they are anticipating an increase to 19%. But the agreed upon time frame for that hasn't occurred yet. So there's, I believe the city's waiting on some additional revenue before they make that step. So some of the issues that they have been facing, though, have been investment issues. They are using, if you'll notice, a market value of assets as their actuarial value of assets. So that does introduce some additional volatility in their funded ratio. They have not had the best investment return over the past few years. Their 3-year net investment return has actually been 0%. As part of addressing that, they changed their investment manager at the beginning of this year, and they have chosen to update their investment policy statement and are moving away from alternative investments with high fees. And so they are definitely making steps towards making some changes. Now, I do think it is a good example of the difficulty when you have a pretty bad investment return. Kind of recovering from that can be fairly difficult. So,
You were just talking about Dallas or Longview?
Longview. Did I say Dallas?
No, I just wanted clarification. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. No. We switched from.
Longview.
Yes. So I don't know if you have any questions specifically about Longview, but I have a couple other plans to point out. Okay. So ERS, Bob mentioned, Chairman May mentioned earlier that ERS did switch their discount rate from 8%, thank you, down to 7.5%. That's not reflected in the AV report, but there are some projections that will have an impact of increasing their amortization period to an infinite amortization period without additional funding. University Park was mentioned at the August board meeting because they were in the process of closing their plan to new entrants. It is my understanding that the city has passed an ordinance to do that. The members have voted to do that, and they will be entering. All new employees will be entering TMRS, the Texas Municipal Retirement System, effective November 1st. As part of that, though, there was an amendment to reduce the employee contribution back to, I believe, 10%, which was where it was before. They had stated that verbally, but that wasn't part of the legislation, so that wasn't included in the analysis that was completed for the legislation. Finally, we have Houston Fire has not been updated. We did receive the initial RSVSs for the various fire or Houston plans, and specifically with Houston Fire, the actuary for the system and the actuary for the city did not come to an agreement, and so their results were more than 2% apart, which means their actual contributions are an average of the two calculations. So we're working with them to determine what their effective amortization period is going to be on that basis. And my understanding is for Muni and police, they did come to an agreement, so we just haven't had an opportunity to update those numbers yet. I believe that's everything I have for the AV report, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenny. Is Houston heading for a vote on the pension obligation bonds?
That is my understanding.
I think
we
it's
have
in
a
December.
week or
In
two is when
November.
early voting opens. Is it late October is when early voting actually opens?
Yes, it opens in late October.
Is there someone here from the San Antonio Fire and Police Fund? You know, we spend a lot of time looking at problem cases around here, and we ought to recognize the San Antonio Police and Fire Fund. A conservative return assumption, very well-funded, short amortization period, and I wanted to express my appreciation for what they're doing, and maybe I can do it at another meeting when they're in attendance. Thank you.
Yeah, I second that.
I second that also, and they have been for quite a few years in a situation where for retirement issues there's a heavy amount of sharing this of responsibility between the city and the fire and police. The municipal are in doing well as a part of TMRS. So they are a real poster child view of somebody doing good things.
I will highlight as a follow-on point that if you look at we've got in our table discount rate and effective amortization period side by side, there's a pretty strong correlation between discount rate and effective amortization period, in that the worse the effective amortization period, the higher the discount rate generally. And that's concerning to me. I think that we could do more to focus on kind of the positives down at the bottom of our sheet that don't often get talked about. But a lot of our A lot of our plans that have very short amortization periods are also very good on funding policy, including the return assumption. And that is a lesson that I hope that other plans see and start moving in that direction. It would be great if we saw other plans view that return assumption not as some thing that is set by the recommendations of experts that work for them, but rather something that is an integral part of their funding policy and has direct implications on the money that goes into the plan and the fiscal health of that plan. And I think that our sheet here is a great indication of that. Kenny, one minor thing. Whenever we talk about AVA and MVA, I just wanted to make a point on, you said that using MVA increases volatility. I would flip that around. We should talk about AVA as masking real volatility in the funded ratio. And that could be a good thing. It could be a reasonable thing to do. But, these things are uncertain. Returns are uncertain. And we should acknowledge that you might have to come up with more money to make up for that uncertainty.
The AVA always catches up to the MVA.
Hopefully. In other words, not calculated properly.
Yeah. Unless you have an 8% return assumption and the real long-term return is 5. Thank you, Kenny.
Thank you. Where are we now? On to the recommendations for system approval.
System actuator reviews, yes. And you can call Kenny will present that as well.
Yeah. So Kenny, we'll let you stay up here to take the lead on this, discussing and considering system actuarial reviews, including the review process.
Yes, so if you'll direct your attention to tab 4, we have a short memo regarding recommended factors for system actuarial reviews. As background, the Pension Review Board is mandated to conduct intensive studies of potential or existing problems that threaten the actuarial soundness of public plans. As part of our approach to help implement this mandate, the board did direct staff at the August board meeting to identify other measures that can be considered other than amortization period to provide a more holistic view of the plan when looking at them. So what we have done is proposed a set of 9 metrics that we would use internally to start the review process. This would not be the end all and be all of how we consider what plans need to be reviewed, but this would simply be the starting point. I would like to point out that one item that we did consider that did not get included in the list was contributions as a percentage of government revenue. It is sometimes a useful metric, but the data is not readily available to do that consistently. We're not saying that it wouldn't be considered. When we do a more intensive review, we just didn't feel it was as easily available as some other items. And what we would like is the actuarial committee members to provide approval and help us prioritize these particular metrics in our review process.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
One question for clarification. One of the factors is payroll growth rate. Is that the assumption?
Yes. It's the assumed payroll growth rate.
I assume that, kind of apropos to the Keith's question, I assume that some of these are kind of threshold metrics, and some of them are continuous metrics. In that, some of them being over a certain threshold would probably trigger you to take a closer look. Whereas some of these metrics, you may kind of line plans up and pick from the ones that are towards the bottom of that list. I'm kind of thinking about the value of having the payroll growth assumption in there in addition to amortization, effective amortization, and how that adds value as another metric.
Certainly. So the payroll growth rate has an impact on the calculation of the amortization period for percent of payroll plans. And so the higher the payroll growth rate, the lower, all other things equal, the lower the amortization period is going to be. And so it does have an impact, and there are a number of actuaries that have started including the sensitivity to payroll growth rate in their calculations or in their reports and illustrating the sensitivity of the amortization period to that assumption. And so it does provide, there is, depending on how high it is, it can, the amortization period can be relatively sensitive to simply a quarter or 25 basis point or 50 basis point reduction in that. And so we thought that in conjunction with with looking at the amortization period, looking at the discount rate, might be useful. And again, this, we're not trying to take these one at a time. It is really taking a look at all of these and considering them together. So it's not, there are other metrics that could be useful as well, and there are, certainly we're not saying that these must be included in the list.
Can you clarify actual contribution as a percentage of ADC? So that's the contribution effort that the plan sponsor is making?
I think that's probably a reasonable statement. So if you recall, in our contribution report, we have started including this metric, and it's basically the Texas government code requires that a plan report a required contribution on a 30-year amortization period basis, or 30 years or less. And so we are looking at the actual contribution that was made in past years compared to that reported required contribution.
So in past years specifically, are we talking about an aggregate figure, an average over some period of time? What do we have in mind?
Generally speaking, when we're just looking at this, we are looking at the most recent information, and then moving towards looking at the trends. And so we're not looking at aggregate information. We're simply looking at snapshot
latest year
items. So yeah, latest year, and then we'll look at the trend of whether they've been moving closer to ADC, or if it just happens to be a one-off year that it's below. It just depends on what information we have readily available.
Okay. We can talk about that more later. Can you clarify forward drop and/or prop? I don't recognize prop. I've heard of plop and drop, but not prop. Can you clarify that entry, please?
Prop is typically post-retirement instead of deferred retirement. So there are some plans that allow their retirees to defer a portion of their annuity into the plan and earn interest on that. There are also some plans that allow the retirees to maintain their drop in the plan and take a distribution at a later date. So we were considering looking at the drop balance as a percentage of fiduciary net position because it is an indication of potential liquidity issues. So we saw an example with Dallas Police and Fire just this last year when there was some concern about whether they were going to be able to pay benefits. A large number of retirees took out their balances, which had a significant impact on the potential return that the plan could earn as well as what was available. So if you have a large reduction in assets due to a large withdrawal, you may have to sell the assets you weren't planning on selling at a loss. And so there are, if your drop balances and that potential does exist, there are some concerns, some additional risk that needs to be considered.
Okay, I would say that as a general philosophy, we need to keep in mind the overall simplicity of this metric. And I would suggest, based on what I just heard, that we consider striking that because I think that item is likely to be unusual at best, and that we consider that issue separately.
Which item are you talking about?
Forward drop and/or prop as a percentage of fiduciary net position.
Yeah, I either go with not going on those or needing a lot of explanation on them. This is not something that you can look around the nation and see a standard way these terms are being used, and So I agree with what you're saying.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask for explanation. I mean, I think that that drop in prop balances, so any of these deferred retirement balances where the key is they're subject to withdrawal, usually a substantial portion of them withdrawn immediately and can cause a cash flow crunch. I understand that. I'm hopeful that that most plans don't look like Dallas Police and Fire. However, I think that we've got I think that we've got a few plans around the state of Texas, which while not so Dallas Police and Fire drop balances were more than 50% of assets on hand and were subject to being withdrawn immediately. I think that is an outlier, but I don't know how much of an outlier it is. For example, the Houston police officers' pension plan, I believe their drop balances as a percent of assets is around 40%. And so I think that this is an issue, given what we've seen with Dallas, that we should keep an eye on. So I was wondering what your concern necessarily was.
Okay.
Around this.
I appreciate that explanation.
I do too. I agree.
I would also add that this information is actually readily available now because with the implementation of GASB 67 and 68, they are required to report the drop balances. That's why we're using fiduciary net position as the denominator, because they're being reported at the exact same date.
So GASB has even taken this as an important metric.
Yes.
Okay. I will rescind my suggestion that we strike that one. I think cash flow is relevant. Changes in discount rate, to me, what's important is what the discount rate is, not whether or not it's changed.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I had questions around why changes were relevant. It seems to me that if you're looking at the discount rate, you're already looking at time trend on some of these things like the ADC. So you could look at time trend on that. I don't know that needs to be one of your key variables that you take a look at.
There were a couple of reasons that we did choose to include it. One, in a period in which the trend is to lower your discount rate, we felt that increases were a potential red flag and an unusual choice. In addition, when considering the relative issue with a particular metric, if a plan has just recently lowered their discount rate, that's going to immediately impact the rest of these metrics and make them look worse without necessarily the plan being in a worse position. So while the increases are a potential red flag, we also felt that decreases were a positive and should be taken into consideration when trying to make decisions.
So I appreciate that. That's a great explanation, and I appreciate the sentiment that we shouldn't ding people for taking positive action, which is basically what you said. However, I think the purpose of the review is to kind of help the plans and the plan sponsor better understand what it takes to get back on a more sustainable track. And I think that that whenever you lower your discount rate, you're really uncovering things that were hidden before. So I agree that one way to say it is they're taking positive action and they're being more transparent about actual plan cost, and they shouldn't be dinged for that. But I think if they do that and they're at the bottom and they would normally trigger some additional help from us, I don't know that we withhold that simply because they took positive action. I don't view these reviews, actuarial reviews, as kind of a bad thing for the plans or the plan sponsors. I think it's a positive thing for the plans. I think it's a positive thing for plan members to help them understand the situation they're in and work through it if they're at the bottom of our list.
And just to quickly add, members, another option to consider is we can definitely take that particular factor out of the proposed list and instead keep that in mind when we apply those or apply other factors more from a subjective standpoint during our in-depth review process.
I think that's a great answer. I mean, I assume in all of this that these factors, it's not going to be, this is going to completely drive your decision to review a plan. If you're going to apply your own judgment and knowledge of what's going on with that plan in some way to determine whether the plan needs some help understanding the situation and working towards a solution.
Absolutely. We're trying to develop just an initial set of metrics to prioritize plans, and because of our ability and our time that we have available to us.
So we're agreed to strike the last bullet, recent changes in discount rate, and we'll take that into account elsewhere.
Correct.
Okay.
Another question or two, if I might, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, and I have one too. I have to go. You're next. Go ahead.
If we strike number 9, then we're left with 8. I like the 8. And if we have consensus on the 8, I'd like to suggest that we ask staff to come up with some framework to quantify each of these. So, for example, we could ask staff to put the amortization period into categories. For example, and this is not a suggestion or a proposal, just to illustrate, an amortization period less than 20 years, 20 to 30, 30 or more, or 50 or more, or whatever. And then so we can develop gradations and get a sense of degree in all of this. And I think that every one of these other categories, that framework that staff proposes here, thank you, is a good illustration. And I think for each of those, if we had a sort of a framework that allowed us to begin to quantify each of these factors, I think that would be helpful. What does the committee think?
That's good.
Yeah, I think it would be very helpful. We can talk a little bit more about the actual metrics. I'm in general agreement. I have a few more questions about them. But I think it would be great, as you have with the effective amortization period on here, if we had our metrics on a sheet like this, we could figure out how to rank order, which metric or metrics to rank order on. But if we could look across and we had color coding similar to what you've got with the effective amortization period, and we could kind of look across and see what that looks like across the metrics, that would be fantastic.
One of the things that's concerned me for quite a few years, but more recently as I've thought about it, and just how you're seeing putting this in, if you are, and it has to do with the size of the plan and the kind of investments and the amount of cost associated with hiring investors to do the investing of the plan. As the plan gets smaller and smaller, if you've got the same plan, if you use like the state employees plan as an example at 7.5% and at their large size, their very large size, their ability to have a broad, different numbers of types of investments and spreading out the way the money is invested works well for them. If you were to brought that same pattern of investments into the real small plans, they basically can't afford a lot of the people doing the investing for the big plans because they're too small. If they're getting a quote from the investment person for them, that's going to be too much. I think they really need to begin to look at a different way to invest their money. I didn't say that very well, but it is
to be paying too much in fees.
Paying too much in fees, yeah. Is this something that we've got in here, or we're going to have in this study? I think it's we've got a number of really small plans that, and you can look and see that They may talk about an 8% investment return, but it's way lower than that.
I think
But
this is-
who is it, you know,
Yeah.
and which plans? I mean, a generalization, the smaller the plan, the bigger the problem.
I think that's a great point that Bob raises. One thing that's not on here, so I guess there are two things that he raises. One is fees and one is actual realized returns. And so it might be worth the committee considering and potentially directing staff to think about doing some measure of the, say, 10-year returns versus the assumed rate of return or something like that that compares returns to the discount rate and just looks at that spread in addition to just looking at the discount rate. Those are kind of two different things. The discount rate is important for funding policy. We also want to look and see how it's actually performing relative to actual returns. On the fees question, that's really interesting too. I mean, I think that there are a lot of questions in the academic world about the value of these the investment managers, and especially even at the size some of our small plans are, whether it's worth it to chase extraordinary returns. And I think that fees is a tricky issue. I'm not sure that I would include it here, just because it's something else that I think the full board should consider. I think it's just very challenging to measure because a lot of we've seen a big shift into hedge funds, alternatives, so private equity, where a lot of the fees are even hidden to the plans. As an example of this, CalPERS is very sophisticated. They had to admit a year and a half ago that they didn't know how much they were paying in fees to their private equity managers. So that's just really challenging, I think, to consistently measure. But I like it's very interesting. We should consider the return versus discount rate point.
It is a real issue. In fact, just last week I was working on this issue in my day job. And what I learned in a cursory review was that in certain quarters that the size of the fund does make a difference, a material difference. I asked Anu and her staff for figures on the state and local pension plans in Texas. And unless I did the math incorrectly, I could not develop a correlation between the return assumption and the performance of this set of plans. But other literature does suggest that there is a difference, and research into endowments and foundations suggests that the difference can be as much as about 1% between the big and the little, more than and less than $1 billion. I'm not sure we should incorporate it into our metric because I think it would be a little tricky to try to incorporate, but I do think it's a relevant issue and that we ought to keep it in mind somehow, at a minimum flagging the size of the plan. And so, when I see a plan that's got $40 million in assets, assuming 8 or 8.25%, that to me deserves attention.
Yep.
How do you feel about a metric? How does the committee feel about a metric that looks at something like 10-year return versus discount rate?
So we'd be quantifying the differential.
The differential, the delta.
Well, because past results are no guarantee of future returns.
I would certainly agree with that. So I think that with what we would be capturing here is an element of this underperformance relative to discount rate in the past, with some belief that could be an indication of future underperformance. Now, of course, especially if they're close, it wouldn't be that big a deal. But if we see consistent, 200 basis point underperformance from the discount rate, then that's a huge red flag.
I think I might be more interested in a real rate of return figure that measures the difference between the nominal and the inflation rate of inflation assumption. That to me is a better indication of how aggressive a fund is being with regard to their future return expectations.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that's probably a indication of their potential lack of understanding of forward-looking inflation.
Well, is our plan here to take this lead this information you put together as a staff and work on it more and come back to at our board meeting, at our actuarial meeting in the future? What's the next step? I don't have a recommendation there. Just
is that a question for me, or was that a question for me or the other members?
Anyone?
Yeah, our hope was to begin work on these as soon as possible, and so we were asking for approval of the metrics at this particular meeting.
Mr. Chairman, I might suggest that we get consensus, which I think we've gotten on the 8, as a starting point, and then as a next step, ask staff to develop a framework for quantifying each of these 8 factors.
And finish all of that before we talk about it at a
before we go further
board meeting.
And there's been some good discussion here about fund size and some other factors, and I think that this doesn't have to be the last of it, but this would be a good next step.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple, so I totally agree with that action plan. I have a couple of other questions. I would love to hear a little bit more. I think it's directly your earlier statement about contributions relative to revenue. I think that's another important consideration to look at if the sponsoring entity has less ability to pay to make up for contribution deficiencies, then that raises bigger alarm bells than if it's a smaller plan relative to government revenue. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your concerns I'm guessing your concerns are on the revenue side and consistent information on government budget size.
Yes, the revenue numbers are not readily available, so it would require specific research into revenue sources. And I know there are some plans that don't add that. Their revenue source could be multiple entities, not just one as well. So,
yeah, I served a couple terms on the Georgetown City Council, and I can affirm what he is saying. The city of Georgetown owns and operates its own utility, and so that creates a revenue structure for the city that makes it multiple times the size of a comparable city that does not own its own utility, but it's a deceiving metric. And, of course, the state of Texas has got countless individual plans and funds. And which ones do we count? Which ones come from federal sources for capital monies only? And, frankly, I think that we're picking up the spirit of this concept in the unfunded liability as a percentage of payroll. I think that's a reasonable proxy for that factor.
That's a great point. A little disconcerting. It sounded like there was some uncertainty on the Georgetown City Council on the revenues that they were receiving. But so another couple of points. I don't know that this is a metric or not, but drop and COLA, of course, are big cost drivers for our plans. Is there going to be any consideration of interest rate on drop accounts or the COLA rate as part of this?
Certainly, we would be looking into all aspects of plans during the intensive review. Again, this list is primarily intended to provide a simple approach to help prioritize the plans, and so trying to get into the more difficult aspects of measuring things is where we would go once we selected plans to perform a more intensive review.
That sounds great. So that is one of the things that you will consider in kind of your subjective look at this, and not necessarily kind of the simplified set of metrics that we would look at across all plans.
Certainly, we would be looking at all aspects of the plans that we choose to move forward with.
The only last thing, I guess two things that I would say is, we've got a range of discount rates here. And that's a little bit challenging in terms of an apples to apples comparison on amortization period on some of this other stuff. I don't know what we do with that. We've been uncomfortable in the past in trying to adjust to the median or something on amortization period. I think that's something we should consider in the back of our mind when we look at this. We've got a little bit of that captured in putting the discount rates on here, but we're still going to be skewed in that some of our plans have an 8% assumed return. They're going to report one amortization period. They're going to be compared to plans with a 7% discount rate with another amortization period, and those are just they're in very different positions in terms of funding policy and sufficiency.
Yes, Mr. McGee, but we are considering the discount rate as a factor.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm just saying it's going to be hard for us on the fly. We're going to consider it, but we'll still look at the amortization period. It's just, it's not a calculation you can quickly and easily make in your head. I'm not necessarily saying that that's something we have to alter, but it is something we need to kind of keep at the front of our consciousness as we look at these metrics. The only last thing I will say is that we should consider the difference between 10-year return and discount rate. I think that adds value here relative to all the other metrics that we've got. It matches assumption to realized in a way that could be very helpful in our ranking system. That would put us back at the original 9, but happy to hear what others think.
Mr. Chairman, I would oppose that because it implies that what's happened in the last 10 years is somehow informative about what's going to happen in the next 10 years or the next in the future, and those two things don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. It implies some relationship that does not exist.
That's interesting, given that most of our plans justify their rate of return by showing us their 10 and 20 year. I don't mean to imply that it's something, an indication of future returns. However, it is a direct measurement of past performance relative to their own benchmark. So I think it's a key measure that kind of shows us how well in the past they have performed relative to that benchmark. I don't know that it has to say anything about future.
Okay. Let's use a couple of examples. Late 1990s, the markets were delivering double-digit returns consistently. And 10-year returns, I don't recall what they were, but I'm sure
probably
they were
30.
Double digits.
Yeah.
Right. Using that information, one could imply or infer, wow, our return assumption is too low. We need to increase that. After the 08-09 market decline, everybody looked terrible. And the implication there was, our return assumption is too high. We need to reduce it. Neither of those instances was informative or useful.
I think that you're naming two of the most historic events that we've ever seen in the history of investing in the country. I think that we're smart enough in our rankings to know that a giant event has occurred and to be able to discount that. Also, what would be affected is if we saw another 2008, all of our amortization periods would be much longer in that next year. I think this is a problem for all of our metrics, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think in going down this road, we're saying we're smart enough to realize what the implications are of events that have occurred very recently.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I just don't know what value one would glean from that information. So our return assumption is 7.5. The last 10 years have been 7.4, 7.8. That doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know what decision we would make based on that piece of information.
I would argue that it's the exact same thing, the exact same determination that we would make on actual contributions as a percentage of ADC. You could make the exact same argument on actual contributions relative to ADC. That gives you an indication of funding effort. That's inflows into the plan, and it shows whether it tells us something about the adequacy of the funding plan.
Well, actual contributions as a percentage of the required contribution is something within our power. It's something that we can control, or the plan sponsor could control. The markets are an entity unto themselves. We can't control those. I
agree with that. The ADC itself is controlled by the markets and has the same fluctuations that the return would have. So it's exactly the same in terms of metric. Here we've got actual contributions, which is in the full control of the sponsoring entity, ADC, which is reliant on market returns. In the metric that I'm talking about, there's the discount rate, which is in the full control of the plan and the sponsoring entity, and you've got realized returns, which is a measure of realized experience.
If I may, I would like to just remind the members that the part of the reason we are selecting multiple measures is so we don't put too much emphasis on one specific measure.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So, Mr. McGee, are you suggesting a ninth metric?
I am suggesting, yes, a ninth metric because I think it adds additional information here that is directly relevant.
Okay. Well, I think we're tied between the two of us, so maybe we could see what Mr. May thinks.
I'd rather stay with the 8. And 8. We're moving into a lot of new material anyway, and that doesn't say we can bring this up later, but I would stay with you.
Yeah, I agree with that. This is not the last that we'll revisit this. This is sort of the next step.
Right.
Yep.
And members, to just remind you, we would be, when we start conducting those in-depth reviews, looking at cost drivers for the plan that we review, and the actual realized return is something we will take into consideration, looking at whether the contribution caught up to any negative experiences that the fund has been having.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So, Mr. Chairman, I see that the staff has suggested that we approve and prioritize the metrics so staff can begin the process of initiating risk assessments and working with the systems that require actuarial reviews. Instead of prioritizing them per se, my suggestion would be that we reach consensus on the metrics and further ask staff to develop a framework for quantifying each of those. And if the committee agrees, I'd like to put that in the form of a motion.
Yeah, I agree with that. With whenever you say framework, I believe you're referencing something that looks like the framework that we've already got for effective amortization period.
Okay.
I agree with that.
And further, to possibly assign a value or suggest a concept to assign values to or weights to each of these.
Point of clarification, when you say weights, you want more than kind of a categorization with maybe a color coding. You want an actual kind of total value across all, or a value within?
Yeah, so a plan with an infinite amortization period, for example, would be rated differently than a plan with a 40-year amortization period. Achieve some description of gradation there.
Would a color coding satisfy that desire, or do you want something that can be aggregated across all metrics?
Well, my hope is that we will end up with some sort of an index in all of this,
Gotcha.
a number or a value that we can use that takes into account these factors and a framework for weighting each of them, and ultimately the machine can spit out a value that could be used for a color, but I don't think that having many colors, sort of a rainbow for each system, would be meaningful.
Would the members want staff to come back at the next committee meeting to present that framework, or?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
At a next actuarial committee meeting as opposed to the whole board as our next step.
So just one quick question for Anu. In terms of logistics here, when are we planning to have another actuarial committee meeting?
We were thinking to have another one in December, but we then thought about if the members approve the factors at this meeting and prioritize them for us, we were hoping to start the review process, select our first set of plans, to start looking at them and come back with our preliminary findings at the next committee meeting, which we thought we could hold in January instead of December. But we are certainly
and we have a full board meeting in November?
Correct.
Okay. Would it make sense for us to go ahead and, I don't know that these factors are necessarily going to change, and at the end of the day, we're kind of telling them to whether or not they can use those factors to start doing their initial investigations into plans. I think we can probably approve that. Perhaps we do as Anu suggested and hold an actuarial committee meeting in January where we get a little information from that initial look and they do what you suggest, or give us an initial framework.
That's fine. I don't want to slow up the process of looking closer at some plans.
And perhaps at the November full board meeting, we could have a sheet that looks like this that provides an update to the whole board on the factors and then kind of gives people a first look at how you would categorize them, but doesn't do the index type concept. Would that be doable? Is that something that we should try to kind of give a first look to the whole board? Just say, here's kind of the factors we're thinking about. Here's how we're thinking about categorizing them.
This
we're
is the
going to work on
direction
this
we're
more.
moving into.
Right. We're going to work on this more at the next actuarial committee meeting. That's going to be informed by an initial look from staff at plans.
I think that's great.
Do
As
that,
Bob
you're
Dylan
saying
said, you don't need a weatherman to tell you which way the wind blows, and you don't need to have an index to tell that there's some plans that deserve a little bit closer look.
I sure hope the Bob Dylan quote makes it into the minutes.
When is
So-
the meeting in November?
The board meeting.
Yeah, what date? Is it?
November 16th.
So just so I'm clear, what you're asking for is a list of all plans and their and factors. So plans, so a list of all the plans and the factors going across the sheet, essentially.
I think yes. I think that where we are right now is we're going to approve the 8 factors that we've got here, and let staff go and do their initial review, create their list of plans, and start selecting plans for initial review, and start that process. At the next board meeting, we would like to see, just like this sheet, a sheet that has the factors across the columns and has the information for all of the plans, and then has a first stab at the categorization. And you could just use color coding like you do for effective amortization period right now. But don't worry about, at that meeting, presenting anything on the index concept that Keith laid out. And then in January, we can get together. So that would be informational, tell the board kind of what we're thinking, get feedback from them. And then at the January meeting, we would be able to discuss your initial reviews of plans. We would be able to talk about the feedback that we got from the full board on the factors. And then you all would have kind of at least a first pass at the index concept that Keith laid out.
All right.
All right.
Do we need a motion to do all the stuff that I just said?
So Bob mentioned that he would also like to ask if folks have any comments.
Oh, comments at this point?
Yep.
Yeah, let's say if there's any comments from the audience on this subject. Come on up and talk to us.
David Stacy, Midland Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund. Just kind of you've had some interesting discussion. I'll save some other comments for later, so stay germane on this. But related to the comment about larger plans, certainly larger plans have the benefit of economies of scale from an investment perspective. In the simplest form, that's a logical conclusion. But there are advantages that smaller plans have that larger plans really can't take advantage of. Now, I'm not saying they all do, or that they all should, but there are some potentially offsetting advantages that smaller plans have. And there are many studies that have been done that indicate that smaller investment shops typically are hungrier and typically perform better than the really large mainstream investment shops. Now, there is certainly risk involved about the doing business with a smaller shop, and that's an assessment that has to be made by the parties making that decision. But there is an opportunity set for smaller plans to do business with smaller managers, and potentially for smaller fees because they're smaller managers and hungrier than the larger plans, and gain an above-market return for that particular management of whatever they're having done. I don't want that to get lost in the discussion that it's all about the big plans and that there's no possibility that a small plan actually could do well. There is an opportunity set that small plans can do well if they judiciously weigh their options and then take advantage of those options that may be available to them. And regarding the 10-year return history, going kind of back to Mr. Brainerd's comments, I think it was very insightful looking at the 90s and then to the 2008. But I would say that the market is full of extraordinary events. It's not like we're going to be rocking along here and everything's okay and it's all going to be good. The market is wrought with history of extraordinary events. And we always look back at whatever the latest event was and go, oh my God, that was the big deal. But if you lived through previous events, and I'm not an old man, but I do study history, and there is a lot of extraordinary events that have happened in the markets in the past. And so I think it's really, from a pension fund's perspective, it's entirely a long-term investor. And 10-year time horizon is long-term in the financial markets, but it has no relevance in the pension markets. I would argue that all day long. And if you're looking for a metric, certainly it may be a trend line, but I think the benefit or the relevance of that particular trend line or that measurement is not really beneficial. I think from a pension fund investing perspective, a period much longer than 10 years would be appropriate, because that would take into account full extraordinary market cycles, either good or bad, that would be a more useful trend. Now, unfortunately, it's harder to react in a 20-year time horizon because everybody wants to jump up and down and go, oh my God, 10 years it's all bad, or oh my God, 10 years it's all good. So I would just implore that you give consideration to a longer period of time than 10 years. 20, 30 years would be much more appropriate from my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stacy.
Any other questions from the audience? We'll move on then.
So we do have a motion
We need a motion.
for this agenda item, and I have tweaked it to say Chair takes a motion to approve the factors as updated.
Okay. We have factors that are as updated that we're, Chair, I'm going to suggest that we have a motion approving that.
So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I would move that we direct staff to proceed with the 8 factors on which we've reached consensus, and further ask that staff develop a framework for quantifying each of those to bring back to the full PRB. Is that correct?
Yeah, initial categorization.
Right. And further that staff, as a parallel, work on identifying a number of plans that in staff's view, considering these factors that we have identified, merit closer scrutiny with regard to their actuarial and financial condition.
Quick question on that, just so we make sure that staff gets what they need. It's my understanding that staff would like to move forward with a set of maybe 3 initial reviews so that we can take a look at kind of that process and the information when we have our next actuarial committee meeting.
Correct.
Is that accurate? So they're asking for authorization not just to kind of consider these factors and create the initial list, but pick, let's say, 3 plans to do some initial look into their actuarial and financial condition and bring that back to the actuarial committee.
Yeah, that was the intent of my motion, and you articulated it more clearly than I did.
All right. Are we ready for a vote?
Yes, so the Chair entertains a motion to approve the factors as updated and to come back at the next board meeting with the initial categorization of those factors, as well as that staff can begin the process of assessing risk and working with systems that require actuarial reviews.
One of you.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, are we ready now for the next item on today's list?
You might want to say the motion passes.
Say what?
That the motion passes.
And that the motion passes. Okay.
Discuss and consider options online public pension dashboard.
Okay, the next item was number 7 on the list. Discuss and consider options for online public pension dashboard. Anu, I think you're going to brief us on that.
Members, as you know, the legislature appropriated $90,000 this session to fund the development or creation of an online dashboard to provide to our customers, including the legislature, taxpayers, as well as our pension systems, with pension data, which is more up-to-date and accessible. And to make sure that we make good use of this funding, we started with putting a lot of thought into what our consumers or customers need. From this dashboard, we looked at the technical assistance or requests that we receive on a regular basis from our constituents, as well as what other peer organizations are doing as far as making pension data more transparent as well as streamlined. We looked at for example, the Public Fund Survey website, as well as the pension plan data website, to gather more information so we can come up with a combination of what our constituents need as well as what other organizations are providing. And considering that information, as well as keeping the goal of making sure that we are able to provide an accessible, searchable, as far as possible, pension data portal that has more streamlined and current information, we started working with our database administrator and came up with our first cut of what that dashboard would look like. And in your meeting packet, we have included a very brief outline of what we have worked on so far. And essentially, what we have in mind is that the website would have 3 sections where we would provide individual plan data. And within the individual plan data section, we will, for each system, provide their plan summary, benefit, governance information, as well as focus on key 10-year data points, for example, funded ratios, amortization periods, and also try to include any comparison to peer groups wherever possible, and to meet the statutory mandate where we're required to provide any information that we receive from our systems. We were also planning to include the most recent reports we receive from our systems on that individual plan section. Then we were planning to also include a comparative plan section where our thought was we could include most recent data comparisons presented by peer groups. For example, we could include data comparison among statewide systems or municipal plans, and also consider wherever possible, maybe under the investment information, to include data comparison by asset sizes. And the last section would be for raw data, where we would provide the spreadsheets on the website, so folks who are interested in downloading that information could easily be able to do that as well. And we are not looking for an action from the members at this point. We wanted to make sure that we are being transparent with what we have in mind with the dashboard, as well as keeping the members in the loop.
Are there any questions from the committee members?
And we would appreciate any thoughts you guys have on the dashboard. And
I think, Mr. Chairman, I think that it sounds like a great start. I would suggest that you include some of the same information that we receive in these reports, which I find to be valuable, and since we've got them ready already, I think a lot of members of the public who are interested in this would find those helpful as well.
Are our reports, I know that they're downloadable as part of the meeting packet. Do we also make them available in spreadsheet form?
We do. Currently on our website, we post the spreadsheet format or the Excel format of these reports as well, or the AV report, excuse me.
I would say that this is an exciting development, and I'm glad that we're being very open and transparent about the data. I would say that Texas and the PRB is a leader in this respect and in providing information this broadly on pension plans within the state. So that's a very positive thing for the state of Texas. The one thing I would say I think the entire exercise looks pretty good, and I'm excited to see what comes out. On the comparative plan section, it sounds like the groups you're thinking about are kind of the different statutory groups that we have within the state, and maybe some cut on plan size. I think that's good. It would be great if, when you're thinking about that exercise, if there was just some way to compare across groups, even if it's just at the average level or the median level, just being able to compare across groups, because it could be that you're super awesome for a statewide plan, or you're super awesome for a municipal plan, but when you compare outside your group, that you don't look quite as good on some of our financial measures. So just being able to compare across groups is going to be useful as well. But this looks like a great exercise.
Anything else from members of the committee? Are there any questions for committee from the floor? Anyone want to come up and talk and raise a point here?
Hi, I'm Julie Higgins. I'm a trustee with the Houston Fire. I've been listening to you guys, and I had just a couple of points that I wanted to discuss. One thing that I thought was interesting to consider in some of these dashboards or different assessments was the standard deviation and maybe risk that the plans are taking. I think that's important. I don't know how you want to think about that, but also the employees, for when you report some of these employees in retirement plans that only that they don't get Social Security. So if their sole retirement money is coming from their plan, so I think that's something to consider too.
Sure, we will definitely take that into consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the audience? Questions?
Bob.
Is that just for this subject, or is this you into the meeting?
He's asking if it's a speak now or forever hold your peace type situation.
That's right. Just before we adjourn, we'll come back in for broad comments. See, next is the date and location of the next committee meeting. We have said that it would be likely in January. Anything else we need to say there?
We will poll you guys probably soon to come up with a date, but we don't have a date set yet. But we'll make sure we let everyone know once the meeting is scheduled.
All right. And I believe that does get us to the point of inviting further comment from the floor on what we've talked about. A broad question, broad answer. What do you want to say to us about broadly these issues?
Well, David Stacy, Midland Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund. Again, I want to thank you for your time and diligence in this process. It's y'all are going through all of the hard work to try to do the right thing for the state of Texas. A couple of clarifications on earlier discussions. This is my experience is more so in the small plan arena, so I can't speak to the larger plan circumstance. But there was comment about actuaries or service providers in general, not weighing in on their professional opinion about what they thought or advised what a assumed rate of return, an appropriate assumed rate of return may be. In the smaller plan arena, there are a number of actuaries that are doing service in that area that strongly weigh in that to the boards as to their opinion based on their understanding and analysis of their investment policy, historical investment performance. Certainly it's ultimately up to the board to adopt what it is, but it is very commonplace for actuaries to weigh in heavily in the smaller plan arena and boards to give strong consideration to that. So it's not as though that the boards are running amok and they're not listening to anybody, or that service providers aren't inclined to be honest with the boards. Now, I can't say that is necessarily the case with the consulting community and the investment portion of it, but in the actuarial community, it definitely does seem to be the case. And I would strongly encourage you to have that continuing or follow-up discussion regarding legacy plan costs. There is, all things being equal, I can see from an academic discussion that a city would have a debt of whatever that debt is, regardless of whatever group or system they were going to pay in. But unfortunately, in practice, things are never equal. And reality is not the same as an academic discussion. And there are too many cases, actual cases, where legacy plan costs were significant when a plan was closed. And I think that's a very appropriate consideration to have in any decision as to whether or not to close a plan or move into another plan or any discussion related to closing a plan. So I would encourage you to continue that discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stacy.
Anyone else want to say something to the board or the committee? If not, we need a second. We need somebody to call.
Mr. Chairman, I move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you.